Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing." These words, uttered by the Creator of the universe himself, marked the beginning of one of the most extraordinary journeys ever recorded in human history. An ordinary man, born in a pagan city, received a call that would transform not only his life, but the spiritual destiny of all humanity. Who was this man before his name echoed through millennia? Born as Abram in Ur of the Chaldeans, a prosperous Mesopotamian city dedicated to moon worship, he grew up in a family that served other gods. His father, Terah, was possibly an idol maker, immersed in the religious traditions of his time. Nothing indicated that this man would become the patriarch of three major monotheistic religions that together encompass more than half of the world's population. What could lead an established man, approximately 75 years old, to abandon everything he knew to follow the voice of an invisible God? This is the first great lesson Abraham offers us: the capacity to respond to the divine call even when it defies all human logic. Imagine the scene. An elderly man gathering his belongings, his servants, his flocks, and departing without a map, without guarantees, only with a promise. "To the land I will show you." There were no precise coordinates, only the certainty that he should leave. And most surprising, "I will make you into a great nation." A promise made to a man whose wife was barren and who had long passed the natural age of having children. When God calls Abram, he doesn't merely invite him on a geographical journey, but on a journey of inner transformation. The divine call always demands a dual movement, external and internal. Externally, Abram had to leave Ur, cross unknown territories, and settle in a new land. Internally, he needed to abandon old conceptions, old gods, old securities. Abram's journey began with an act of separation. Genesis 12 verse 1 is explicit. "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household." Notice the progression. First the country, the cultural environment, then the people, social ties, and finally the father's household, family identity. Each circle represents a deeper layer of identity that needed redefinition. But why would God choose an ordinary man of advanced age to initiate his redemption plan? What was in Abram that qualified him for such a mission? The Bible maintains an intriguing silence about Abram's previous merits. There is no mention of great deeds or extraordinary piety before his calling. This absence of explanation confronts us with an uncomfortable truth. Divine choice frequently transcends our criteria of worthiness. As we will see, Abraham's greatness wasn't in his initial qualities, but in his willingness to respond to the divine call and allow this call to transform him. His journey wasn't linear nor free from stumbles. There were moments of doubt, fear, and human solutions to divine promises. But through these ups and downs emerges the portrait of a man who learned to walk by faith. And what was the final destination of this journey that began in Ur? Canaan was merely the geographical destination. The true destination was the birth of a new form of relationship with the divine. A relationship based on faith and promise. A relationship that, centuries later, would be described as friendship between God and a man. The journey of faith rarely follows a straight line. For Abraham, the path between promise and fulfillment was marked by long periods of waiting, by human attempts to accelerate divine plans, and by moments of profound doubt. It is in this tension between promise and fulfillment that we find some of the deepest lessons from his story. 10 years had passed since Abraham arrived in Canaan. 10 years of waiting for a son who did not come. The divine promise of a great lineage seemed increasingly distant. How could an 85-year-old man, whose 75-year-old wife was barren, become the father of a multitude? Time, relentless, seemed to conspire against the promise. It was in this context that the first great temptation arose, replacing the divine plan with a human solution. Sarah, seeing the biological impossibility of conceiving, proposed an arrangement common in that culture. "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go, sleep with my servant. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abraham accepted the proposal and united with Hagar, the Egyptian servant. This episode reveals a dynamic that frequently repeats in our own lives. When the divine promise delays, we seek human shortcuts. Abraham and Sarah weren't necessarily rejecting the promise, but trying to help God fulfill it. They didn't realize that in doing so, they were reducing a supernatural promise to merely human dimensions. The birth of Ishmael, fruit of this union with Hagar, brought consequences that Abraham did not anticipate. Family tensions arose. The relationship between Sarah and Hagar deteriorated. What seemed a practical solution transformed into a source of conflict that would reverberate for generations. As we will see later, this decision would have historical implications that extend to our days. But what makes this story particularly fascinating is that even after this human detour, God does not abandon his original promise. 13 years after Ishmael's birth, when Abraham was 99 years old, God appears again and renews his covenant. It is at this moment that Abram receives a new name, Abraham, father of many nations. Sarah is also renamed from Sarai to Sarah, princess. This change of names wasn't a mere linguistic detail. In ancient culture, the name carried the essence of identity. By renaming Abraham and Sarah, God was declaring a fundamental transformation in their identities. They were no longer just an elderly, barren couple, but the future progenitors of nations. Abraham's incredulous laughter at the announcement that Sarah would conceive a son reveals how impossible the promise seemed, even to the one called Father of Faith. Abraham fell face down. He laughed and said to himself, "Will a son be born to a man 100 years old? Will Sarah bear a child at the age of 90? This moment of doubt humanizes Abraham. His faith wasn't blind acceptance, but a constant struggle to believe in the impossible. And then, against all odds, the impossible happened. Sarah conceived and gave birth to a son who was called Isaac, which means laughter. The name carried both the memory of Abraham and Sarah's incredulous laughter and the joy they now experienced. The Son of Promise had arrived, not through human efforts, but through divine power that transcends natural limitations. This part of Abraham's journey confronts us with a disquieting question. How often, in our impatience, do we substitute divine promise with human solutions? And more deeply, do we truly understand that God's timing rarely coincides with our expectations, but always aligns perfectly with His purposes? Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. These words, perhaps the most disturbing in all of Abraham's narrative, introduce the episode that would become the apex of his spiritual journey. After decades of waiting for the Son of Promise, after finally seeing the impossible become reality, Abraham receives the most incomprehensible command: sacrifice that very son in whom all divine promises rested. The biblical text describes this episode with an economy of words that amplifies its emotional impact. There is no mention of the tumultuous thoughts that certainly passed through Abraham's mind during that night. We don't know if he argued with God, if he wept in silence, if he spent hours in inner agony. What we know is that early the next morning Abraham got up and began the journey to Mount Moriah. This immediate response reveals something profound about the nature of mature faith. After decades walking with God, Abraham had developed a trust that transcended rational understanding. Not that he understood the divine command. How could he? But he had learned that God was trustworthy, even when his ways seemed contradictory. The 3-day journey to Moriah must have been the longest of Abraham's life. Each step brought him closer to the moment when he would have to sacrifice not only his son, but apparently all divine promises. How could God fulfill his promise of a great lineage through Isaac if he were sacrificed? This apparent contradiction is precisely what makes this test so severe. The dialogue between father and son during the ascent to the mountain reveals the dramatic tension of the scene. "Father, the fire and wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham's response, "God himself will provide the lamb," can be interpreted both as a pious evasion and as a profound declaration of faith. Perhaps it was both. What was going through Abraham's mind at that moment? The author of Hebrews offers a fascinating perspective. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead, and this interpretation suggests that Abraham's faith had evolved to a level where he could contemplate even the possibility of resurrection, a concept practically unknown in his time. The climax of the narrative occurs when Abraham, having bound his son on the altar and taken the knife in his hand, is interrupted by the divine voice. "Do not lay a hand on the boy. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." This moment represents the culmination of Abraham's spiritual journey. The test wasn't about human sacrifice, a practice that Mosaic law would later vehemently condemn, but about Abraham's willingness to surrender to God what was most precious to him, including the divine promises themselves. The provision of the substitute ram, caught by its horns in a thicket, introduces a theological theme that would echo through biblical history: the principle of sacrificial substitution. Many theologians see in this episode a prefiguration of Christ's sacrifice, the Lamb of God, who would be offered on the same mount centuries later. The divine words that follow this event reaffirm and expand the original promise. "I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed." Abraham's obedience not only preserved the promise but expanded it. This episode confronts us with profound questions. Are we willing to surrender to God even what we have received from Him? Does our faith endure when confronted with apparent contradictions? Do we trust in God's character even when His ways seem incomprehensible? Among the many roles Abraham played in his spiritual journey, one of the most fascinating and frequently overlooked is that of intercessor. In an extraordinary episode, we see the patriarch engaging in a face-to-face negotiation with God Himself, revealing a dimension of divine human intimacy rarely equaled in biblical narratives. The context of this intercession is somber. God reveals to Abraham His intention to judge Sodom and Gomorrah, cities notorious for their extreme wickedness. Abraham's response to this revelation is surprising. Instead of simply accepting divine judgment as just and inevitable, he assumes the posture of an advocate, pleading for divine mercy. Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? This audacious question initiates one of the most extraordinary conversations recorded in the Bible. Abraham continues, "What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will you really sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of the 50 righteous people in it?" What makes this dialogue so remarkable is not just Abraham's boldness in questioning divine plans, but how he grounds his argument. He appeals to God's very character. "Far be it from you to do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous and the wicked alike. Far be it from you. Will not the judge of all the earth do right?" This approach reveals a profound understanding of divine nature. Abraham isn't trying to persuade God to act against his own character, but is appealing precisely to this character, to divine justice, as the basis for mercy. It's as if he were saying, "I know who you are, and I know that your justice cannot contradict your mercy." Thus, what follows is a gradual negotiation, where Abraham progressively reduces the number of righteous needed to spare the cities, from 50 to 45, then to 40, 30, 20, and finally 10. At each stage, God agrees to the terms proposed by Abraham. This scene raises profound questions about the nature of intercessory prayer. Was Abraham really changing God's mind? Or was God, through this dialogue, educating Abraham about the tension between justice and mercy? Perhaps both were occurring simultaneously. The outcome of the story is well known. Not even 10 righteous were found in Sodom, and the city was destroyed. However, Lot and his daughters were spared, not explicitly due to Abraham's intercession, but the text suggests a connection. So when God destroyed the cities of the plain, he remembered Abraham, and he brought Lot out of the catastrophe. This episode reveals a crucial aspect of mature faith, the ability to intercede for others, even for those who seem undeserving of mercy. Abraham had no personal obligation to the inhabitants of Sodom. He lived separately from them and knew their wickedness. Yet, moved by compassion and a sense of divine justice, he positions himself as a mediator between God and those condemned cities. Abraham's intercession prefigures the prophetic and priestly role that his descendants, especially Moses, would later play. Indeed, when Israel sinned with the golden calf, God reminded Moses of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, an invocation that echoes Abraham's own intercession. This facet of Abraham's life confronts us with a challenging question. How willing are we to intercede for those who seem undeserving of mercy? Does our understanding of divine justice lead us to plead for the condemnation or the redemption of those who err? Abraham's intercession also illuminates the meaning of the previous divine statement. Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? God shared his plans with Abraham precisely because he knew the patriarch would respond with intercession. True intimacy with God is not just a privilege but a responsibility that invites us to participate in his redemptive work in the world. When Abraham breathed his last at a good old age, an old man and full of years, at 175, he left behind much more than earthly properties and flocks. His true legacy transcended material possessions, extending through time and space in ways he himself could hardly imagine. As we examine this legacy, a question imposes itself. What does it really mean to be father of many nations? In a literal and historical sense, Abraham became the progenitor of multiple peoples. Through Isaac, the Israelites and Edomites were born. Through Ishmael, various Arab tribes arose. The children he had with Keturah after Sarah's death originated other ethnic groups in the Middle East. But Abraham's impact goes far beyond physical genealogy. 3 major monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, recognize him as a spiritual patriarch. Billions of people around the world, with no genetic connection to Abraham, consider themselves his children in a spiritual sense. As Paul would write centuries later, those who believe are children of Abraham. This extraordinary phenomenon leads us to a deeper understanding of the original promise. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Abraham's legacy is not limited to a specific ethnic lineage, but extends to all who share his fundamental faith in the one God who calls, promises, and fulfills. A frequently neglected aspect of this legacy is the transformation of the concept of divinity that Abraham introduced to the ancient world. In an era dominated by polytheistic pantheons, where gods were seen as capricious forces of nature, Abraham presented the revolutionary conception of a personal, moral God who establishes covenants and keeps promises. This vision of God transformed not only religion, but human understanding of morality, purpose, and history itself. The idea that history has a direction, guided by a God who works through generations to fulfill his purposes, finds its origin in Abraham's experience. he introduced into human thought the notion that seemingly disconnected events might be part of a greater divine plan. Another crucial element of the Abrahamic legacy is the concept of faith as the appropriate response to the divine call. Abraham was not commemorated for his military conquests, like many ancient heroes, nor for his philosophical wisdom or artistic achievements. What distinguished him was his willingness to trust and obey a God who frequently led him along incomprehensible paths. This emphasis on faith as the central principle of relationship with God represented a radical break from contemporary religions, which typically emphasized elaborate rituals and material offerings as means to appease distant deities. Abraham introduced the revolutionary notion that God desires primarily our trust and obedience, not our ritual sacrifices. The very concept of covenant, berith in Hebrew, which would become central to Judaism and later to Christianity, finds its paradigmatic expression in the relationship between God and Abraham. This covenant wasn't a contract between equals, but a divine commitment guaranteed by oath, symbolized by rituals such as circumcision and God's passing between the divided animals in Genesis 15. Perhaps the most profound aspect of Abraham's legacy is what James, in his epistle, would call God's friend. This extraordinary designation captures the essence of the spiritual revolution that Abraham initiated: the possibility of a personal, intimate, and transformative relationship with the Creator of the universe. This divine human friendship wasn't based on status or achievements, but on mutual trust developed over decades of walking together. Abraham learned to recognize God's voice, to trust His promises even when they seemed impossible, and to submit to His will even when it defied human understanding. It is this relational dimension of faith, more than abstract doctrines or elaborate rituals, that constitutes the core of the Abrahamic legacy. The revolutionary idea that the transcendent God desires communion with His creatures, and that this communion develops through a journey of faith, continues to transform lives millennia after the patriarch's death. Abraham's journey through the unknown didn't end with his death. His legacy of faith continues to inspire and challenge spiritual seekers in every generation. The man who left Ur of the Chaldeans without knowing where he was going has become a beacon for all who venture beyond familiar securities in response to the divine call. Abraham's story reminds us that authentic faith is not a static formula, but a dynamic journey. It's a path of highs and lows, of promises and waiting, of human stumbles and divine faithfulness. It's a journey that transforms not only our destiny, but our very identity. Like Abraham, we are invited to leave our comfort zones, to trust in promises that transcend our natural capacities, and to discover that the God who calls is also the God who fulfills. We are challenged to develop a faith that not only believes in God, but trusts Him enough to act based on His promises. Abraham's true inheritance is not a geographical territory, but a spiritual posture. The willingness to walk by faith, not by sight, trusting in the God who transforms ordinary pilgrims into bearers of blessing for all nations of the earth.